This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
And this is Camila Paldam, who is an associate professor at the University of Aarhus in Denmark, where her research interests are avant-garde art and theory, especially surrealism, collage techniques and surrealist legacies in contemporary art, also discussed as a multi-sensory phenomenon, and also sexuality studies. And she currently heads up a multidisciplinary sexuality studies research team, looking in detail at the relationship between sexuality and culture. Camila has a huge list of publications, so I won't read all of these out now, but two of her recent publications include a book chapter called Erotic Utopia, Wilhelm Reich's Influence on Danish Surrealism, and also she's currently edited a book recently called Art, Technology
and Nature. Art, Technology and Nature.
Sorry,
yeah.
Art, Technology and Nature, that's right. She's also got an article in the book and written a very long introduction to the book. And she'll be speaking tonight, I'm really looking forward to this, on the child as catalyst for change, free upbringing, free sex and socialism in the early 20th century. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is this one on?
Yes.
Yes, it's on. Okay, good. Yes, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I have attended several of these history of sexuality seminars with great pleasure, and I'm very happy to be here today as a speaker. I have my background in literary history, art history, and sociology. And as Jane just told, a couple of years ago, I started an interdisciplinary research group on sexuality studies. And today it comprises me and 10 PhD and postdoc students. At the moment, I'm working on a big grant application, including several scholars, on cultural processes of sexualization and desexualization of the child, both today and in a historical perspective. And therefore, I'm very happy that this seminar is co-hosted with Life Cycle Seminars, and I hope we get the chance to talk after the seminar, as I'm very interested in collaboration on these topics. But I better start my real talk now, because I have promised you these 45 minutes. Okay. In the first decades of the 20th century, new theories of children, upbringing, and sexual education evolved in the wake of Sigmund Freud's writings on children's sexuality. Also, expressionist, Dadaist, and surrealist artists took an interest in the child, glorifying its unspoiled spontaneity and open-mindedness. Common to both theorists and artists of the period was a focus on liberation. This, however, could be understood in many ways and to different extents. German psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich held one of the most radical beliefs, that a sexually free upbringing would ultimately lead to a perfect socialist society. The aim of this talk is to investigate and contextualize the role of the child in some of the revolutionary utopias of the 1930s. Wilhelm Peterson was a Danish artist with a cosmopolitan outlook and an extensive international network. In 1930 to 31, he went to the Bauhaus school, and a couple of years later became a driving force in communicating the ideas behind surrealism to a Nordic audience. He published magazines and curated exhibitions with contributions by well-known European surrealists. And in 1934, he published the first comprehensive introduction to surrealism in a Nordic language. It's a book you can see here, called Surrealism, Outlook on Life, Conduct of Life, Art. The book is in many ways close to the concept of surrealism found in André Breton's first Manifesto of Surrealism from 24. One key difference, however, is that Bjerke Peterson was inspired by Wilhelm Reich, who fled to Denmark in 1933. This talk will address how Reich's psychoanalytical and socialist theory influenced Bjerke Peterson's surrealist utopia, especially regarding the role of the child. Reich's writings will be contextualized by means of writings by child theorist Albert Moll, and Hans Zulliger and Nelly Wolfheim as a way to understand how radical Reich's theories were in comparison to the more pragmatic approaches suggested by otherwise progressive thinkers of the time. It is well known that French surrealists valued eroticism very highly. Inspired by Freud's emphasis on sexuality, they wanted to investigate sexuality, both in almost scientific roundtable sessions aimed at revealing the true nature of sexuality, and in text and artworks with symbolic or literal sexual content. In the surrealist attempt to free the mind from all norms and cultural restrictions, children and women were idealized as they were believed to be closer to nature and the unconscious, and thereby to have easier access to a forgotten and repressed origin. Freud writes in The Interpretation of Dreams from 1900 that childhood retrospectively seems to be a paradise, and that dreams can return us to this paradise. It seems to be this paradise of childhood that the surrealists sought. When Breton, in the first manifesto of Surrealism, writes about the child, it is mainly in terms of a nostalgic longing for a free and unrestricted mind and life. Breton acknowledges that the unrestricted spontaneity of the child is being spoiled by authorities, but he nevertheless holds on to a romantic, elusive idea of childhood, one in which children has no worries. The connection between the child and a forgotten or repressed origin also found support in Freud's Totem and Taboo from 1913. Here Freud suggests a parallel between the child and the primitive, as he says, and compares the phases in the development of man's views on the universe, and he takes it from animism to religion to science, and the stages of an individual's libidinal development. The animistic phase corresponds to narcissism, the religious phase to the stage of object choice, of which the characteristic is a child's attachment to his parents, while the scientific phase would have an exact counterpart in the stage at which an individual has reached maturity, has renounced the pleasure principle, adjusted himself to reality, and turned to the external world for the objects of his desires. In animism, magic is fundamental to the way of thinking. Everything that is created by magic is created because man wants it, Freud says. And the primitive man has great confidence in the power of his desires. Magic is ruled by the principle of the omnipotence of thoughts. For the adult in our culture, the omnipotence of thought has, according to Freud, only been retained in art. Exactly this was of great importance to the surrealists. Their aim was the liberation of the repressed modern individual who had let go of the pleasure principle and adjusted to reality. In Freud's account of art, the omnipotence of thought is preserved, and the magical experience of the artist is compared to that of the child. Freud's view informed the wish to hold on to childhood in surrealism. As Max Ernst confirmed when he wrote this folder for his first collage exhibition in Paris in 1921, and I know it says 1920 on the poster, but it isn't right. It's just to confuse the viewer. So it was in 21, and it says, "You are just kids. You n'êtes que des enfants." Okay. The main line in the thinking of Danish Bjerke Peterson's book is very close to these themes in French surrealism. Early in his book, he introduces Freud, and in agreement with the first manifesto of surrealism, states that the surrealist should work unconsciously without any intervention from reason, and that automatism is a means of doing so. He wants to liberate thought and sexuality from all constraints, prescribing a total rejection of reason and consciousness in artistic creation. He also praises the playful child and regrets how it is being repressed by the morality and rationality of adults. Bjerke Peterson refers to Freud in his initial explanation of the development of the child. When the young child is playing, countless symbols are created for what it desires, and the play is far from reality and reasoning. Gradually, the child understands more of its surroundings and builds its ego on the reasonable and moral answers provided by adults. The pleasure principle is overturned by the reality principle that becomes the governing principle of action taken by the ego. The desire of the id is hereby repressed and modified. Society, not least school, educates children to believe that only rational actions are true and right. And Bjerke Peterson refers to the systematic repression of all emotional life and sexuality. This is not just a general theoretical statement. As will be elaborated later, he addresses the actual social and political conditions and proposes concrete changes in education and upbringing. This political indignation and wish for political change seem to stem less from Freud than from Reich, whom he also mentions in a section entitled The Repression of the Child. Bjerke Peterson's views on childhood are thus less idealized and more directly political than was the case in French Surrealism. Reich was a sharp critic of Hitler and fled to Copenhagen in 1933, as I said before. During the 30s, several of his books were published in Copenhagen, and Bjerke Peterson refers to the mass psychology of fascism from 1933 in his book on Surrealism. Reich's psychoanalysis differs from that of Freud in several ways. It is a revolutionary, utopian thinking which suggests that a free and what Reich calls natural sexuality, which is not burdened by morals and restraints, will automatically lead to balanced happiness and to socialism. In Der sexuelle Kampf der Jugend, the sexual struggle of the youth from 1932, Reich comes to this conclusion by referring to unspecified native people who, according to Reich, live in a proto-communist society. They have no words for theft, and they have a satisfying, unrestricted sexual life. Sexual offenses do not exist, there is no brutality between man and woman, and rape is unthinkable as there is no need for it, he writes. Reich has developed this theory in Der Einbruch der Sexualmoral, the emergence of sexual morality, from 1931, drawing primarily on the ethnographer Malinowski's studies of the Trobrianders in Papua New Guinea. According to Reich, this tribe is a matriarchy characterized by a free and undisturbed sexual upbringing, in which adults and youngsters have no repressions or perversions. The life in the tribe can therefore be regulated by sexual satisfaction of the drives instead of by moralistic norms. As he writes, I quote, "A healthy person contains virtually no morals, but also no impulses which will require moral inhibition." End of quote. In contrast to this, sexuality is not free in Western society. Religion invokes fear of desire and shyness about the genital, and people are repressed by morality and institutions such as family and marriage. The suppression of infantile sexuality is, according to Reich, the primary cause of natural sexual desires and perversions later in life. Like the Trobrianders, children should be raised without any restrictions. They should be allowed to follow their natural sexual impulses, both when they are young and during adolescence. Reich suggests that a liberated, natural sexuality will free mankind of any suppressive impulses. Sadism does not exist in his ideal world, just as it was not found among the Tropianders. Freud, responding to Reich, claimed that culture is built on repressed sexuality, that cultural achievements are successes of sublimated sexual energy, and that human culture is always in need of the superego, as human beings will always harbor violent impulses. Reich agrees that most people in modern culture have many infantile, cruel, and asocial impulses, but argues that ethnology shows us that there are highly developed cultures where such impulses are lacking. The need for suppression is not a given, as Freud argues, but is constructed by the organization of society. According to Reich, instead of just adjusting to society and accepting suppression, as Freud does, psychoanalysis should be used as a liberating political tool. Reich was just one of many theorists writing about children in early 20th century. In the wake of Rousseau's Emile, notions of the unspoiled natural child and of upbringing and education were addressed by a wide range of theorists, some of the most important being the German pedagogue Friedrich Fröbel, who founded the first kindergarten in 1837, the Swedish feminist Ellen Key in her The Century of the Child from 1909, and American philosopher and educational reformer John Dewey in Democracy and Education, 1916. After Freud had addressed children's sexuality in 3 essays on the theory of sexuality from 1905, where he claimed that children are sexual beings and that repressing the sexuality may lead to neurosis later in life, the interest in children's sexuality also increased. In The Child's Sexual Life from 1908 by German psychiatrist and sexologist Albert Moll, it was an elaborate study of children's sexual life. And when I say elaborate, it's really many hundred pages. Moll criticizes Freud for seeing sexuality in acts that have nothing to do with it. For instance, children's thumb sucking or sucking on objects such as pencils. And in order to avoid a one-sided focus on the pathological, he primarily bases his book on information drawn from, he writes, healthy men and women, not from patients. The child's sexual life is, on the one hand, a very detailed and nuanced description of children's diverse sexual behavior, and on the other, a moralistic warning against deprivation, all presented as a mixture of scientifically based general material and mundane and curious observations. For instance, that a long journey to school with many bushes along the road entails a risk of lewd acts among children, or that in order to prevent masturbation, the child should not stay too long in bed in the morning, especially if it has a warm duvet. Moll provides a comprehensive account of sexual acts involving children, including mutual masturbation, children's access to pornography and its damaging influence, and pedophilia in its many varieties. For a reader today, it is remarkable that authentic photographs depicting children involved in sexual acts seem to have been rather well known and widespread in 1908. Child pornography was definitely not introduced with the internet. Moll is aware that morals and costumes are not absolute, and that the given norms decide what causes shame and disgust. He therefore emphasizes the importance of finding a happy medium in sexual education, which should be provided by the mother, not by the school, in order that girls will not associate sexuality with shame and disgust, making it difficult for them to enjoy sex later in life. Moll also rejects some of the earlier warnings against masturbation, for instance, the claim that masturbation could cause cancer, and makes it clear that masturbation, if not done excessively, is not particularly harmful. However, he maintains that it is dangerous for both health and soul, and gives advice on how to resist it. There are thus some hints of liberation in Moll, even though religion and suitable moral behavior still play a strong role in his argument. It was his book. The Swiss school teacher and psychoanalyst Hans Zulliger was one of the most influential educational professionals in the psychoanalytical tradition after Freud. His study, Gelöste Fesseln, was translated into Swedish, which indicates the extent of interest in his work, as many people in the Nordic countries were perfectly able to read German. The book consists primarily of cases from Zulliger's work as a school teacher, recounting his conversations with more or less troubled children. Sexuality is a recurrent theme, focusing in most cases on the child's curiosity and fear regarding adult sexuality. By means of several examples, Zulliger shows how lack of knowledge and misinformation may lead to severe fear and anxiety, concluding that objective sexual education is required. As long as sexual matters are surrounded by secrecy, children draw their own conclusions and wrongly regard the sexual act as shameful, despicable, or as a violent fight. He relates one boy's fear of castration to shame of masturbation, but neither approves nor condemns masturbation explicitly. And he neutrally explains the use of condoms to a girl who has found her parents' prophylactics in a drawer, however telling her in the end that condoms are no safe remedy for birth control. He does not make this last remark as part of the information, but rather in order to avoid the girl later in life, I quote, might think that contraception could be a convenient means to avoid the consequences of intercourse. End quote. While Zulliger believes in factual education leading to a more natural view of sexual matters, he does not advocate sexual activity among youngsters. Nelly Wolfheim, a German pedagogue and founder of the first psychoanalytical kindergarten, wrote the widely recognized Psychoanalysis and Kindergarten in 1930. Here she also addresses children's sexuality and suggests a freer approach, criticizing, among others, the Italian physician and educator Maria Montessori, still widely known today for the educational method that bears her name, for not raising the issue of children's sexuality. Regarding the question of sexual education, Wolfheim, in line with Zulliger, states that information should not be imposed on children, but that they should be provided with clear answers when they ask and show interest in sexual matters. She writes, I quote, "It is all about a general openness that makes all cover-ups needless and also rejects the usual half-hearted, poetically altered ways of educating. The aim is to lead the child to a stage where it learns to perceive sexual matters naturally," she writes. Wolfheim addresses children's masturbation, sucking on thumbs, doctor games, scatological interest, and erotic friendships with other children. Psychoanalysis has taught us to regard masturbation as a natural act in this age group that, when practiced in the normal way, does no harm and does not require further action, she writes. Only in the case of excessive masturbation, whatever that means, should intervention be considered, and they should never be done in a way that would cause anxiety in the child, as threats in themselves can have many harmful consequences and lead to neurosis later in life. However, masturbation should only be allowed, I quote, as long as the child does not masturbate openly. That means in a way that is noticed by the other children, end of quote. And Althheim writes that any intervention should take place gently as a friendly talk. Althheim also addresses children's erotic friendships, which in many ways resemble erotic friendships, relationship between adults, characterized by withdrawal from other children in order to be alone with each other, demands for exclusivity, strong jealousy, and desire and attempts to touch one another. Althheim claims that this subject has not been addressed by others, explicitly pointing to Moll. However, both Zulliger and Moll do address children's love letters and their infatuation with other children, or with an adult, such as a teacher, leading to the same obsessive wish to be constantly close and to kiss and touch as described by Althheim. Moll, for instance, writes about jealousy. The boy is tortured by torment when he sees that his beloved friend becomes involved with someone else. And Zulliger quotes a couple of examples of love letters sent by school children and calls them naive, innocent, and harmless. They should be regarded with a smile, but represent a necessary, not to say healthy, step in the liberation from the parents. Although kisses are mentioned in the letters, Zulliger does not address what should be done if youngsters' love leads to a desire for further bodily contact. As his examples regard school children, the children in question are a bit older than the preschool children Althheim writes about. She acknowledges doctor games as a widespread activity among this age group, but writes that they should be counteracted, both because it is impossible to tell if the passive party is hurt, and because it is in the interest of the child's adaptation to reality, she writes. Despite the widespread understanding and acknowledgement of children's sexual activities and her wish for a natural approach to sexuality, children thus have to learn to follow the norms of society. Sexuality still belongs to a private domain and should to some extent be hidden and secret, it appears. Although Reich is listed in her bibliography, his influence is weak, if present at all, while there are plenty of references to Freud. Reich's pamphlet on sex education, Der sexuelle Kampf der Jugend, is written for the youth with no upper or lower age limit. He here proclaims that everyone should have access to sexual satisfaction without being slave of reproduction. This means that sex education should include not just facts on procreation, but also on contraception. Reich discusses different means of contraceptions, for instance, providing detailed and illustrated instructions on how to insert a diaphragm, but acknowledges that when it comes to sex, what really interests young people are questions of pleasure and satisfaction, and not contraception, regretting that this is rarely included in sex education. Reich compensates for this lack by drawing curves of sexual arousal and describing the whole sexual act from initial kisses and caresses to different phases of intercourse until the ideally simultaneous orgasm. Reich was not the only one addressing pleasure and birth control at that time. In England, Mary Stopes had published Married Love in 1918, and the book was controversial not least because it mentions contraception, although the sequel, Wise Parenthood, was much more explicitly instructive, as well as focusing on the mutual pleasure of man and woman, having the simultaneous orgasm as a goal too. Stokes regrets that many women never have an orgasm and are left frustrated and restless after intercourse next to their sleeping husbands. As something new at the time, she reveals how women's desire follows the menstrual cycle, peaking twice every month, and underlines the importance of foreplay to prepare the woman for enjoying intercourse. This book was, however, not aimed at youngsters in general, but particularly at the married couple. Stokes praises love, but for the one and only. In that sense, the book was an attempt to preserve marriage as an institution, rather than liberating sexuality as such. This approach is very different from that of Reich, who does not write about finding the one and only. On the contrary, he stresses the importance of trying different partners to find a perfect, if perhaps temporary, sexual match. Young people should have sex when they feel like it, and they should have access to both contraception and to a private room for their activities. It should not only be tolerated that youngsters have sexual relations, it should be positively facilitated. This position is rather radical compared to that of the other prominent theorists we have discussed. The biggest difference from the other theorists of sexuality is Reich's combination of sexual liberation and socialism, topics he sees as completely intertwined. On the one hand, there is no other way to sexual liberation than the revolution. On the other hand, sexual repression is a capitalist means of keeping the people pacified. The obedient and submissive position the parents demand of their child resembles the relation between worker and leader and civil servant and state. These thoughts, which obviously invoke the political situation at the time, especially in Germany and Italy, are developed further the following year in The Mass Psychology of Fascism. Here Reich describes how suppression of the natural sexuality in the child, particularly of its genital sexuality, makes the child, I quote, afraid, shy, fearful of authority, obedient, good and docile in the authoritarian sense of the word. It has a crippling effect on man's rebellious force because every vital life impulse is now burdened with severe fear. And since sex is a forbidden subject, thought in general and man's critical faculty also become inhibited. In short, morality's aim is to produce acquiescent subjects who, despite stress and humiliation, are adjusted to the authoritarian order. Thus, the family is the authoritarian state in miniature, to which the child must learn to adapt himself as a preparation for the general social adjustment required of him later. End of quote, as you can see here. As an instructive example on how religion represses sexuality, but also how a sexually liberated upbringing can change society, Reich writes about a 7-year-old girl who had been raised an atheist. Usually she always masturbated before going to sleep at night, but one day she suddenly fearfully renounced her habit and began to pray compulsively instead. As Reich puts it, prayer had taken the place of sexual gratification. However, the girl, who had a complete confidence in her father, talked to him about her fear and told him about 2 recent incidences. One in which she was playing at having intercourse with a boy and was interrupted by another boy shouting shame at them, and another where an old witch-like woman cursed her and her friends who sang communist songs on their way home. After that, she suddenly felt afraid that, I quote, perhaps there really was a God who sees and punishes, end of quote. However, talking to her father helped. And I quote, you can see it here. The compulsion to pray disappeared when she was made aware of the origin of her fear. This awareness made it possible for her to masturbate again without feelings of guilt. Some months later, the little girl wrote a letter to her father from a summer camp. Here comes the letter. Lieber Carly, there is a cornfield here, and we have set up our hospital on the edge of it. Only pretending, of course. We always play doctor there. We are 5 girls. If one of us has a hurt on our ding-dong, then he goes there, where we have salves and creams and cotton. We swiped all that. And then Reich writes, who will deny that this is sexual cultural Bolshevism? End of quote. So, Reich regards a sexually liberated upbringing as a means and necessity for creating revolution. Children's sexual activities are not just regarded as natural and acceptable if performed discreetly in private, as in Althheim, but are apprehended as good and healthy and nothing to hide from anyone. There are no attempts to adjust to common norms or morals, quite the contrary. Free sex is a revolutionary weapon. Hereby, pleasure becomes almost as compulsory as abstinence and virtue were before. Not masturbating becomes a problem that should be analyzed and solved, and the role of the father has changed from repressing sexuality to accommodating and facilitating it in a comradely fashion. And now back to Danish surrealism and its influence from Reich. Because in line with Reich's theory, Bjerke Peterson defends children's right to free play as, he says, all repression of play is repression of life. It is important to try to understand the child from birth and to give it freedom to pursue its desires. Through unhindered play, the child will develop into being open-minded and take an active part in life. This also applies to teenagers who mature sexually just to find all routes to sexuality blocked, as he critically writes, continuing in the style of a political manifesto. And I quote here, therefore we must demand that all kinds of play be respected as true realities of life, that from earliest childhood all compulsory education end in favor of freely chosen studies, that the teacher-pupil relation end and be replaced by comradeship, that sexual life as soon as it matures have free opportunity to unfold, as it is respected as the highest form of life. Bjerke Peterson comments explicit on the mass psychology of fascism, writing that Reich is undoubtedly right when he claims that educating the working class by explaining to them how sexual repression is a weapon of capitalism will lead to destruction of this weapon and stimulate a proletarian revolution. And he sees a close connection between communism, surrealism, and psychoanalysis in the demand that morals should be adjusted to the drives and society adjusted to the people. However, Bjerke Peterson criticizes Marxism for rejecting art as a means of revolution. He believes that surrealism will be able to expedite the proletarian revolution because it is capable of providing fundamental changes. And here another quote. Surrealism transforms man's outlook on life completely. It rejects bourgeois logic and reason in favor of free expression of drives, instinct, and impulses. It is not society that needs to change. It is above all man himself. The completion of this work is the actual task of surrealism. Through the awakening of our drives and instincts, surrealism will implement the psychomaterialist revolution. Bjerke Peterson believes in the liberating potential of art. its ability to change norms, to change human life. With implicit reference to Freud's argument in Totem and Taboo, he authenticates the power of art with a parallel to rituals performed by savage people. Savage people have an intuitive understanding of the unconscious, he claims, and gives two examples of Navajo Indians having instinctively used psychoanalysis to heal people suffering from depression and frigidity, with proven results. In one of the cases, the healing happened by use of sand paintings that worked through the symbolic imagery. Bjerke Peterson finds this remarkable, that images can have that strong an impact of the beholder. And, I quote, "It shows us how the very nature of shape and color has a real content, and how the functions become living concretions in our unconscious life." End of quote. Reich does not seem to share this faith in art's ability to change human life, just as Freud never embraced the Surrealist project either. And Reich's and Bjerke Peterson's means to realizing their erotic utopia differ in several other ways too. In Die Sexualität im Kulturkampf, later published in English as The Sexual Revolution, for instance, Reich writes, "Any type of obstruction of the child's or adolescent's sexual life by parents, educators, or government authorities should be prohibited. In what form this prohibition should be enacted and secured cannot be said at present, but the necessity of social and legal protection of juvenile and infantile sexuality is not to be doubted." This is rather radical. In order to protect the natural development of the child, Reich is also willing to censor books and visual material that, according to him, might disturb the natural development. Reich opposes pornography and argues that literature, such as trashy novels and children's horror stories, should be forbidden in order to build a healthy sexuality. Bjerke Peterson is less militant and does not advocate any restrictions on human expression. He mentions a painting he has done, which would be deemed pornographic according to convention, and discusses whether he should create such a work. His conclusion is that perversions do not exist. Any erotic act is beautiful and natural as long as it is performed with true love and meets a true need, he writes. Despite these differences, there is no doubt that Reich's theory had a great deal of influence on how Bjerke Peterson conceptualized his surrealist utopia, linking sexual liberation closely to socialist revolution. Bjerke Peterson did not think that the vision of a sexually liberated society would be easy to fulfill. He was not that naive. He turned to surrealism because he saw in it an opportunity for the artist to act, to break into reality, and he optimistically wrote, "When we have achieved limitless freedom, we will transform the whole world to an expression of the fantasies of the drives." End of quote. It was a theoretical utopia of sexual liberation, eroticism seen as the only vehicle for revolution, and it had to start with a child. Thank you.
Thank you.